So my name's Anthony. I'm one of the leaders here at the church. Been a member of the church for a very long time, but I don't always preach. So it's quite a different experience being up here talking rather than playing the guitar. But today, what we're preaching on is Psalm 23, which is a very common song that we sometimes sing. Indeed, I think we sung it last week. Maybe? Anyone who was last week could confirm that? Yes, we did. Because when I asked, can we do this one at the end of the sermon? Matthew texted me and said, we already sung it last week. So I'm like, okay. But it doesn't matter. We're going to go through it together today. It's very famous, isn't it? And I think deservedly so. It's well structured. It's relatively short and self-contained and compact. I guess the translation is good. You know, it has a certain ring to it. Perhaps that's why it so easily flows into a song that we're very familiar with singing. And according to crosswalk.com, it's the 8th most popular Bible passage. If you try BibleGateway.com, they rank it a little bit higher. They say it's the 4th most searched for Bible passage on Bible Gateway. And of course, there's that famous song of Stuart Townend's that means this is very much part of our Christian vocabulary, right? It's the sort of thing that we might well have on a tea towel, if you're that way inclined. You know, the Lord is my shepherd on a tea towel, if that's the sort of thing you're into. But it's also made its way, hasn't it, into secular culture, right? Gangster's Paradise, that's referenced here, the Valley of the Shadow of Death. Vicar of Dibley, yeah, the theme tune for that, Howard Goodall, who's a secular composer, wrote that piece, and it's got a real nice nostalgic feel to it, hasn't it? It makes you think of Dibley, this lovely village where the sun always shines, and it's all good. And when I was approaching this, I think there's potentially a danger with how familiar this is to us and to other people in the world, that it can kind of just sort of waft past, you know? It can all seem quite quaint, maybe slightly removed from reality. And in fact, actually, if you think, we're often bombarded with these little quotations, aren't we, like on your social media feed, like Facebook or LinkedIn. I had one recently from Dwayne Johnson that says, "Wake up determined and go to bed satisfied." Sounds great, doesn't it? Not sure what meaning is there behind that, though. And you know, we could quite easily flash up, the Lord is my shepherd. It's great, and we could be in danger of just moving on. And certainly I think that's a danger with being over-familiar with this. So it's what better remedy to that than to come together and just have a good look at it together, really. So that's what I hope we can do over these next few minutes. I'm going to be reading from Psalm 23. Apologies, my version of the ESV is slightly older, so there might be a few words that are slightly different. We might also hop around in some other passages that possibly won't come up on the screen, but don't worry about that. I'll read them out, and we can always share them later on. So let's get the words up on screen and have a look through it. And broadly speaking, it's composed of two different metaphors, if you will, two different images, different pictures. The first of those, in verses 1 to 4, is a common one in the Bible, and that's of the shepherd and the sheep. And the Bible is literally full of shepherds and sheep. Sheep. If we think, back to, Joseph out in the field with his brothers tending the sheep, we've got shepherds in Bethlehem. We've got this passage. King David himself was a shepherd before he was elevated to be king. The Bible is full of stories of shepherds and of sheep. And that makes it a good metaphor because I think it's quite easy to explain what that relationship is like. And probably it's only in the last couple of hundred years as a society that we've moved away from, maybe the majority of us at least, if not being shepherds, knowing someone who has something to do with livestock. But it's not that hard, I don't think, for us to picture what that relationship is between a shepherd and his sheep. I didn't go away and consult any shepherds. I think we've got enough here to do that in itself. And in this particular role play, our position is as the sheep, okay? And in fact, That's the first challenge, I think, from this passage is, do we really want to visualize ourselves as the sheep in that relationship? And actually, the Bible talks about the sheep. And if we look at, for example, Isaiah chapter 53, verse 6, it says, "We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us have turned to his own way." The idea that sheep have a propensity to wander off, and they actually need the correction of the shepherd to stay on track. If we're to fully align ourselves with that metaphor, we have to sort of slightly humble ourselves, I think, and accept that if we're going to be the sheep in this story, that's a challenge to our own sense of self-importance and self-confidence. So to really immerse ourselves in that metaphor, I think we've got to confront that initially and think, am I prepared to be the sheep? Am I prepared to view myself in that way? The second metaphor that we come to is in verses 5 to 6. Again, a very familiar picture. It's one of a meal, a situation in which God is the host and we are the person, the recipient of his hospitality. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. So in this scenario, we are the recipient of God's hospitality. Again, familiar to us, we all understand that picture. I think to really immerse ourselves in it, though, there's a slightly bigger sense. This is not like a come dine with me situation. Pop round someone's house, have dinner, judge how good it was, and move on. This is really, I think, about security and safety and provision. We're very fortunate in this country that food is not as scarce as it is in other parts of the world. And I think it's helpful for us to when we read about a meal being set, a table, a feast, to think about what security that brings with it. It's not just popping around to someone's house for dinner. It's a significant thing. And again, it's not us that are the hosts here. It's God. So to put ourselves in that metaphor, I think we've got to slightly accept that slightly humbler position at the start and say, I'm the recipient here. It's God's hospitality, not mine. And if we can put ourselves in the metaphors in that way, I think that will help us understand them and get the most out of them. And there are a couple of things that I think we need to think about, or we can think about on this psalm. And the first is this, that each of those pictures has something immediate about it, but it grows into something much bigger. It grows into something eternal. So each of these metaphors starts with an immediate benefit, but grows into something eternal. So let's take verses 1 to 4, if we flick them back on the screen, and let's go through it and see what we mean. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. Great, wouldn't that be a great place to be? He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. Fantastic, exactly what a sheep needs. But then it grows, doesn't it? He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. Sheep, I think, are fairly easily pleased. We've got pet rabbits at home. They give nothing back. They're useless. But they are fairly easily pleased. If we give them food and shelter, they seem quite content in life. And I think this psalm starts with that idea that there is a basic and immediate need in life, and God is able to provide that in his role as the shepherd. But then it goes beyond that, because I think we are more complicated than sheep. And we have different and bigger needs. And actually what he does provide for us is he refreshes our souls. I don't know if you feel that your soul needs refreshing. I certainly did approaching this passage. Life is very hectic, life is very busy, and we can so quickly put God to one side, to the detriment of our soul. The idea of the shepherd being able to refresh our soul, that's a wonderful thing. He guides me along the right paths, or in the translation I've got here, paths of righteousness. So it's not just leading us, go this way, go that. It's the right way. That's the claim of the shepherd. He can lead us the right way, ways of righteousness. So we might think, if perhaps someone who's just seen that tea towel on the oven, I don't really need a shepherd. I've got plenty of green pasture and still water, or the equivalent, whatever that might be. Maybe. But what about our souls? What about the path of our life? What about, are we going in the right direction? That's something the shepherd is able to offer. The second metaphor, if we flick to the next verses, again, starts, I think, with a fairly immediate need being met, the need for food. You prepare a table before me, right? So we need food, we need sustenance. And as I've said, I think in the context of this metaphor, it's about security, it's about safety, it's about permanence. And God, as a host, is able to provide those. But then it grows from there as well, doesn't it? You anoint my head with oil. I think, thinking back to King David, when he was selected to be king from amongst his brothers, if you remember the story, he was anointed by Samuel the priest. The idea that we're chosen by God, anointed in some way, is a wonderful thing. And that goodness and love would follow us all the days of our lives. And then ultimately, to the biggest perspective, that we would dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's far beyond just this kind of simple illustration of a meal, I think. This is about caring for our eternal souls. This is about caring for us in a deeper way than just the daily basics of what we need. So both of these metaphors, I think, give us a real strong sense of caring for the immediate, but growing into the eternal. That's the first point. The second point is that, as I say, you could be in danger of taking the Vicar of Dibley view and saying, oh, it's lovely, isn't it? Lord's my shepherd, got nothing to worry about. Life's going to be easy. Neither of these two metaphors claim that. They both acknowledge that life is not going to be free from trouble. So if we look at verse 4, and we step into the metaphor of the sheep and the shepherd. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and staff, they comfort me. It doesn't pretend that these sheep won't have to walk through some dark valleys. Or in other translations, the valley of the shadow of death, which is, a very dramatic visual description. And you can well imagine as a sheep. I think, in which Star Wars is it where R2-D2 was trundling through the canyon and the jar was, peering out? I think there's a bit of that in there. You're wandering through. You don't know what's in the shadows. We don't know what life's going to come. And very often, the shadows are full of death and danger for the sheep. This passage doesn't say the shepherd won't lead us through dark places at all, I don't think. I think, in fact, it says that it's sometimes going to be necessary for us to go through dark and difficult places where there will be danger. And ultimately, death is all around us. We will all be touched by it in some way at some point. There's a famous quote, isn't there? Life's a game and no one gets out alive. We will all be touched by death at some point and in some way. Those valleys are very real. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination for us to visualize that, both as sheep and as people. But we are not to fear. We're not to fear. That is the claim of this passage, and we'll come on to that in a second. And the second metaphor, if we look at verse 5, we see the table is prepared for us in the presence of our enemies. Enemies were a very real thing in David's time. Often they would be a military enemy, threatening the very existence of God's people in their place. For us, I think our enemies can be perhaps more subtle and less obvious, but nonetheless present. Romans 7 describes how actually what wages war on our souls is sin, and our desire to do the things that are contrary to what God wants for us. And again, this metaphor doesn't say, join up, be part of the God's flock, and you'll never be tempted again. You'll never have to deal with anything that's going to be difficult. Our life's going to be a breeze, a walk in the park. It doesn't say that. But what it does say, although the enemies are there, they can do nothing to prevent you from having that meal. So although we are surrounded by enemies and difficulties, the message of the psalm is that nothing can separate us. Nothing can separate us from that relationship with God that's evidenced through the meal that we have with him. So both metaphors give us that real strong sense that life is going to be difficult. But you know what? If we stick with the shepherd, if we stick with the host, with the Lord, then we will be able to endure. Sounds too good to be true almost, right? How can that really be the case? King David is able to write this in a glorious moment of, enthusiasm and closeness with God, but in our daily lives, really? Have no fear in the face of death, really? That's because I believe this passage points us to something or someone still to come. There's a joke, isn't there? Kids club, and the kids are sitting around, and a new and really enthusiastic teacher has come along, and he's got a picture, and he gets a picture out. It's a picture of a squirrel. He says, kids, can you tell me what this picture is? And these kids have been in church for a long time, right? So they know what Kids Club is about. And they say, you know what? It looks a bit like a squirrel, but I'm sure the answer must be Jesus. You won't, okay. My Claire said don't do that one. I probably shouldn't have done. You get the point, though. The answer is Jesus. It's an unashamed habit of us at Christchurch here to take a passage and say, well, look, that points to Jesus, right? That's kind of how we do things here. But let me show you why I think that's the case. If we were to read John chapter 10, verse 11, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. See, Jesus knows this passage, and he claims to be the good shepherd. You see, that picture of shepherd and sheep, okay, in the Psalms, in the way David expresses it, it's that relationship between God and David. But to some extent, it was also supposed to be fulfilled, at least partially, by the relationship between God's people and their leaders, right? And what do we know about the history of God's people? That They don't match up to what they're supposed to be. And for example, if we read Ezekiel 34, which is Ezekiel prophesying to God's people after everything's gone terribly wrong, and he says, and God says to Ezekiel, "Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel, and say to them, even to the shepherds, thus says the Lord God, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves, should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, you slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep." And that's a pattern that carries on and carries on through the history of God's people, that these leaders who are supposed to, in some way, represent and embody what the shepherd is supposed to do, fail time and again. But Ezekiel prophesies something else. He prophesies a time when, if we look at Ezekiel 34 and verse 15, God says, "I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, and I myself will make them lie down, declares the Lord God. I will seek the lost, and I will bring back the strayed, and I will bind up the injured, and I will strengthen the weak. The fat and the strong I will destroy, but I will feed them in justice." So even though our earthly role models and our earthly leaders are not able to match up to this metaphor, God promises that he will do. And in Jesus, he does. You see, one of the things there's so many things in this passage that we could pull out, but I just want to pull out a couple of reasons why I think it's really helpful to consider Jesus when we're considering the Lord as our shepherd, if that's okay. And the first one is in verse 4. So if we click to verse 4. Because I think this is one of the hardest claims to grapple with, right? Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. How can we really say that? How can we really have conviction about that? The passage says, "For you are with me, your rod and staff, they comfort me." Now, obviously, the rod and staff, they're the implements with which the shepherd does his shepherding. And I guess they have probably loads of different roles, correcting staff and what have you. But one of the ones that I think is quite important is when David before he becomes king of Israel, he's a shepherd. And if you remember the story where David slays Goliath, right? He's kind of plucked out of obscurity, presented before the king. And you remember the story of the giant Philistine who's challenging Israel, and David turns up with a slingshot and a stone, and he kills Goliath and saves Israel in that particular occasion. He takes with him his staff on that occasion. He takes with him his staff and a slingshot. That's what he needs. And as a shepherd, he described how he fights off lions and he fights off bears to save the sheep. So one of the roles of how are the rod and staff, how are they comforting? They're comforting because they secure victory against the evil. Yeah, not necessarily just fighting off the bears and the lions. But in the case of Jesus, what we know about Jesus, what we've celebrated in communion, is that he died and was crucified, was buried, and then raised again. As we sing so often, triumphing over the grave, "Death has no hold on me," as we often sing. The fact that he has risen again, and that as we trust in him, we can therefore be confident that we will also rise again from death. And that through him doing that, he has defeated sin. We can have that same confidence. That's how I think the rod and the staff, they comfort us. We know that even though there is evil around us and there is death around us in this world, Jesus has defeated that. And that we can spend eternity with him. John 3:16, probably the other at the top of the list. When I said this famous verses on Bible Gateway, the top was John chapter 3:16. "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." That is the success the victory that has been won through Jesus on the cross. And that is the way we can fear no evil. For we know that Jesus has been there before us and defeated it. And then to pick on the other metaphor as well, if we look at the second half, verses 5 onwards. It reminds me a lot of a passage that I think Ash preached on a couple of weeks ago. John chapter 14. If you can remember. Did he preach on chapter 14 a while ago? I think he did. Let me read it. John chapter 14. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. If it were not so, would I have told you that? I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. So Jesus, we read that we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. How is that possible, and what does that mean? It's explained in Jesus. In that he goes before us, he prepares a place for us, and he calls us to be with him. If you read the Bible and you just got up to Psalm 23 and you stopped there, I think you'd be left asking, how is this possible? But when you turn the page forward and you get to Jesus, you see how it's possible. And I think that then leaves us with the question, really. Because what you've got here, I think, you've got David saying, the Lord is my shepherd. And then you've got Jesus saying, I am the good shepherd. And the question to us is, are we willing to make Jesus our shepherd? Are we willing to follow him, knowing that there's satisfaction to be had in this life, yes, but also no guarantee of an easy ride? Because what we're looking for and our security and our hope is eternal, not just immediate. So it comes down to that tea towel, right? On the oven. The Lord's my shepherd. I think I probably did a disservice to it at the start in sort of dismissing it as perhaps slightly fleeting. You know what? If we were to have a bumper sticker, the Lord's my shepherd, yes, we might look a bit weak. Yes, we might have to deal with the fact that we are the sheep in the relationship, that we're prone to wander. But actually, if we dig into it and accept it and follow it, then you know what? That wouldn't be a bad Facebook post, was it? And I think it could go pound for pound with Dwayne Johnson and whatever he might spout off about positivity and prosperity. So I think that's what it comes down to. And interestingly, Stuart Townend, when he wrote the song that we often sing based on this song, it follows much of Psalm 23, not all of it, but much of. But it comes to that point, doesn't it, where it encourages us to sing, and I will trust in you alone, and I will trust in you alone. Because that really, I think, is the response, the challenge of this psalm is, will we trust in God? Will we make him our shepherd? Will we enter into his hospitality? And will we trust in him?